Now, my friends, you have the opportunity to hear from a really important figure in the United States today. We have with us today Helen Zia. And Helen is the child of immigrants. She may say something about that. Her parents came to the United States. She herself has this distinguished academic career. She was a member of the first co-educational class at Princeton. She was breaking barriers like that. And then she did all sorts of things. She's worked in construction. She's become a labor activist. But what we probably know her best for is her work on the immigrant experience and the place of Chinese Americans and Asian Americans more generally in the United States. You may know My Country versus Me, the book that she wrote with Wen-Ho Lee about his experiences, a scientist who was essentially put into solitary confinement for a couple hundred days and ultimately was not convicted of multiple crimes, a relatively minor crime. Later, the federal judge apologized to him. She documented this, where he was racially profiled. And this is an issue, of course, in the United States today. And it's something that David Zweig talked about in that conversation that I mentioned at the outset. But you've also perhaps read her book, Asian American Dreams. But the book that I want to encourage you to read is this one, and it's not going to be quite so impressive on a Kindle, but Last Boat Out of Shanghai. This is a fantastic read, and I heartily encourage you to get this book and to read it. Ladies and gentlemen, we are so fortunate to have Helen with us. Helen, why don't you take it away?
Well, Clay, thank you very much for that really enthusiastic and generous introduction. I caught some of your presentation, and I'm just fascinated by what you were talking about. And I would like to say that over the years, first of all, as Clay said, I'm the daughter of immigrants from China. I was born and raised in New Jersey, grew up during the Cold War period, after the Chinese Revolution, and some of my learnings about my own parents led me to write the third book that he held up, Last Boat Out of Shanghai. And through my experiences as a Chinese American, I was very aware that China plays a very uneven pendulum swing in the United States of whether it's a friend or a foe. And when I was growing up, it was mostly as a foe. And during the McCarthy era, my father was investigated by I'm sorry, I just had a little tech glitch there. Can you still hear me?
We can.
Okay, great. But so my father was investigated by the FBI. I was frequently told, go back where you came from and worse. And so things like that made me wonder whether my place was in America, where I was, baseball, apple pie, and hot dogs, or this place, did I belong in a place called China, which I had never been to, and but was frequently told to go back there, as well as much worse. But I think in the short time that we have, and I know that we want to save time for questions, I want to talk a little bit about those experiences and connect them to today. I'm very honored to be talking to many teachers here, because in my very traditional upbringing of my Chinese Confucian home and my incredibly strict father, we were taught that my parents were God and teachers were right there with God. So I'm really thrilled to be with you. So one of the things that Clay mentioned was the Vincent Chin case. The time that I was in Detroit, Michigan, he talked about U.S. relations and tensions with Japan and China over the years. So when I was in Detroit, as an auto worker to be part of the labor movement in Detroit, it was another time of incredible economic crisis in the USA. An oil crisis had begun in the late 1970s, and by 1982, the country had already been in a deep depression. Well, some say recession, but I was in the Midwest. It was a depression. The manufacturing sector of the United States had collapsed and never regained its former role as the main engine of the US. That was a time when we shifted into this, what we are now, more of a service economy, an information economy. And so with the collapse of the auto industry and the tensions with Japan, Japan was labeled as the enemy of America, literally the enemy. There was a constant echo in the news. If you had a graph of all the news that talked about Japan, you would see it covered in a line like Clay had shown about U.S. China stories. It would have been U.S. Japan, and how Japan is the enemy, and how we should send atomic bombs back to Japan, and how anybody. And so this is how that got translated in the popular culture of the late 1970s and early 1980s, that anybody who looked Japanese was also an enemy. And as a kid who had grown up in the US at the heels of World War II and the war with Japan, during the Korean War, and the enemy was Korean, and then as a teenager through the Vietnam years, when anybody who looked Vietnamese was the enemy, and then to be in the 1980s, it was a continuum where the enemy was Asian, East Asian, and looked like I did. So when I was a kid growing up in, and going to the Saturday matinees when they had such things with other kids, there would constantly be these war movies where the enemy would be, there would be that crescendo in the film where suddenly the theater would rise up, the American heroes would be, who are of course always white, would be, beating the heck out of the enemy, and the theater would rise up with kill them, kill them, kill them. And of course, when the lights came on, the people being killed looked like me. So, so when the economy collapsed, the manufacturing sector collapsed in Detroit, there was the blaming of people who looked Japanese, and a young man, a Chinese American man named Vincent Chin, was out for his bachelor party. And unfortunately for him, there were two white auto workers who saw him and said things that I won't repeat on this Zoom, but basically chased him through the streets of Detroit and killed him, bashed his brains out with a baseball bat that night. And that became the landmark civil rights case involving a Chinese American, one of the first cases involving an Asian American that rose to a federal civil rights case. And so it was during that time that I began tracking. I was an activist, I was a journalist, I had already begun my journalism career, and I wrote about that case. I followed it. I was one of the spokespeople during that time. And that led me to tracking hate crimes, seeing the connection between hate crimes, not only against Asian Americans, but also against, every targeted group at different points, and really seeing the relationship between times when people of Asian descent, Americans of Asian descent, have been vilified throughout American history. And so I guess I wanted to say that, I want to leave time for us to answer any questions that you might have about those connections, because they are very close. But I want to link that to today, because not only do we have a pandemic of COVID-19, but we also have a pandemic of racism. And I call it a pandemic because this is global. We are seeing incidents of hate and violence against people who look Chinese around the globe. And here in the USA, we've already seen 3 websites go up ever since the end of March, when the quote China virus began to be used as a racist epithet, actually. And 3 websites went up to track and record people who would self-report if they encountered harassment, bullying, beatings, and attempted killings. And in fact, we know that there have been very, very severe incidents. And so as soon as those websites went up, one of them in the first week tracked 800, more than 800 self-reports in the first month. We've already seen more than 2,000 self-reports. And I have to say, self-reporting is undercounting. And in fact, the most serious and egregious of those attacks have never been reported on these websites. So we're in a time that actually we can see has happened throughout Asian American history and in recent history, whether it's the killing of Vincent Chin or the many attacks on South Asian Americans and Muslim Americans following 9/11. So we're in a time that following on Clay's presentation really tracks a lot of what's happened globally in the past, where people of Asian descent, and in particular, this on and off again relationship that we've had with China, where Chinese in particular have been targeted. And I guess I'm sorry to say, something that you all know already, we are in that time today. For those of you who are teachers, what that means is we have already seen bullying and attacks on kids who look Chinese in schools. Even before the lockdown here in America, there were reports of children being beaten up at schools where they were beaten so severely they had to go to the hospital. And so during these times we're in, there have been 2 trends that I've been tracking for really decades. One is the rise of China as well as other countries in Asia and the Pacific. And we know that that this has very serious implications for the USA, which has long been a superpower on its own for a time. And now it's got, strategic competition from China, but there are also other rising economies in Asia. So that's one big trend. The other is the growing numbers of people of color in the United States and the demographic changes that is an inevitable trend that we are encountering. Some people will say that demographers initially had said by 2050, there will be no majority race in America. Now it's down to about 2042. I've been tracking this for some time. I think it's going to be within the next 10 or so years, so in the 2030s. But so these 2 trends have created a lot of internal angst in the USA, and I think we are at that point today where we see these not as a future convergence, but we're at that convergence today. And so we also have that compounded by COVID. And so all of the tensions and fault lines and including hate and racism that have existed in the USA festering have now really boiled over. We see the health disparities. We see all the things that Asian Americans are also experiencing, but we are also being blamed for that. And, Vincent Chin was killed 3 years into a very long recession in the USA. We know that we're only at the beginning of a terrible economic crisis that is global, and no economist is even venturing to say when this might end. And people are sick, in pain, in misery, and also having deaths in their families. And so, so on the one hand, I will say we, as an American people, must recognize that we're at a very difficult time, and we have a choice, either coming together and finding a way to solve these things together, the pandemic of COVID and the pandemic of racism, or we can continue on this splintered road, which many people say is deliberately happening to keep people divided. And we know that that's a very old technique that people in political power have used to continue their own agenda because people are too busy fighting each other. So as teachers, I would say that there is an opportunity today because there's a discussion going on in this country and the world around Black Lives Matter, around what is the connection of all people, including Asian Americans, to the question of systemic racism and systemic oppression. And so this is a time where teaching about these things and connecting the dots for not only children, but for all of society to show how we are all in this together. What are our commonalities? What are things we need to really address? How can we change this so that we can stop repeating the history that Clay talked about, that I talk about and write about? We don't have to repeat history, but first we have to learn about it and see how we each are part of that, and we have a voice where we can make a change. So with those introductory remarks, I'd like to turn it over to all of you for your questions and comments.
Helen, that was fantastic. And for all the people that are part of the webinar today, definitely, if you haven't already seen it, see Who Killed Vincent Chin. And Helen is one of the people that made that film possible. And this is, a tragedy on many, many different levels. And it begins, though, with the question of identity, the question of other. And we see that, we have, of course, the Chinese Exclusion Act. Then we have a gentleman's agreement to keep Japanese out. Now, this happened a long time ago, but the question that you highlighted in these various films and things like that it's not that distant. And so maybe you could say, why is it so hard, or why is it proven difficult for many in the United States to see people of Asian ancestry as people of Asian ancestry who are also Americans?
That's a great question, Clay. Why is it so difficult? I've been trying to answer that for a long time, but one of the reasons that it's difficult, I think, is it's actively fomented in a way. It's out there as a tool, whether it's as a deliberate, conscious effort to show that there's this group that is, potentially dangerous and scary, the purveyor of disease, which is how Asian Americans, Chinese first, and then other people from Asia and different ethnic groups were seen as carriers of the bubonic plague. And here we are today being accused as carriers of this disease, but that's happened back and forth. And so why is that? I think there is a side to human nature where it's when we are frustrated and angry and want to see things change, that we blame other people. And it takes our higher understanding, another part of our brain, not our, animal cortex, but which sees fight or flight, but the part of the brain that sees understanding and connecting. But the danger is because it's easy to exploit these old images of people from Asia who can never be American. Well, that was said about Germans. Ben Franklin said that about Germans. They could never be integrated into American society. Professor Erica Lee wrote a book, an excellent book about the making of America and xenophobia. And she shows how throughout American history, the Germans, the Irish, the Italians have been treated as the outsiders and the feared infectious agent into America for many different times, but gradually were accepted. For Asian Americans, people of Asian descent, that just hasn't happened. And I think it's convenient to use people who look different. I mean, after all, racism is only effective when you can target a group and show that they're different and make them into subhuman elements that, you rob them of their humanity, put them on the margins. And we see that's happened to Asian Americans, as well as African Americans, Latinx people, Native Americans. But our special place in American history is to be seen as the enemy, and today, certainly with this rising tension with China, as the spy, where every Chinese waiter is potentially a spy, where 18-year-old students shouldn't be admitted as international students because they are spies. And what is a spy but a danger to national security? And that's why Wen Ho Lee was arrested and put into solitary confinement for 9 months. And we're seeing more and more scientists, engineers, business people who are being arrested and having their livelihoods and their entire reputations destroyed because of this. I mean, starting from the White House, which I call the white supremacy house, and the FBI director, I mean, they are pounding this anti-China mantra on a daily basis. And the presidential campaign is heating up. The GOP playbook already says, blame China for everything. And unfortunately, I think we're going to see that matched by the Democratic candidate. I hope that doesn't happen. But this is where we can make a difference through education, to break through those stereotypes that get repeated in cartoons, in public culture, in Hollywood. And that's why I say we have a moment. We have a moment that I hope we turn into a movement where every one of us, everybody has agency, has the ability to speak up, to say something, to educate ourselves, to decolonize our minds of the things that we've been taught, really the poisons, I call them, the toxins that we've taken in of how we view other people who are not like ourselves. And so this toxin about people of Asian descent has been pervasive for more than 100 years. It's been, poisoning American culture in the way that Asian Americans are seen. And I think we really have to find ways to change that. Because if we Asian Americans want to be part of this discussion, this conversation of how we can change American society to not go back to, quote, normal, because normal was not great. Normal is what brought us here today into these problems that are just so accentuated by COVID. And we want to talk about systemic change and how Asian Americans fit into that. And if we're continually seen as the foreigner who has no stake in America except to rip it off as the model minority and to step on other people, then we can't be part of that solution. So why is this a pervasive thing? There are a lot of reasons, I think, but we can change that. We can stop repeating this history, and every one of us has a role to play in that.
Absolutely. There's, we all bear a responsibility. We all have to be engaged. And that's what you've just said, right? That the issue here is getting to our commonality. What connects us, what binds us, where are we the same, instead of a fixation on ways in which we may be different. Because that tribalism, you can play on that. And we see that at work. And we've seen how fear is a powerful lever in these sorts of things. For our many, many teachers in this audience, what can they start to do come fall with their students to get at that commonality, to break down the idea that we are first and foremost separate?
That's a great question. And as fall approaches and schools begin to teach again, and however that might be, I know there's just a lot of questions on how that's going to go, what innovations can be used to do this teaching. And I would say storytelling is one of the keys. Teachers have a special role to play because you have access to filling and reaching out to the minds of young people who really, are not born racists, are not born thinking that people are bad and going to hurt them if they're from another country or they look different. And so how do we present stories that really build that feeling of, these people can be my friends. They might not be in my neighborhood. They might not be in my church because, and why is that because? And, for the different levels at every opportunity to take the teaching materials, the books and films that are available, the videos that really talk about other people and their lives. I think that's one of the ways. As a writer, I've tried to find those stories. I think we have generations today that only hear about how divided we are. I think especially after 9/11, the concept of fear and the fundamentalism that people who look like me are right, Americans are right, and if you're not with me, you're against me. That's when that theme not only dominated here in the USA, but also around the world. That's why we have so many totalitarian and dictatorships forming that are all, it's all about their power. And so there were times in our history where people of Asian American backgrounds, people of color, people of conscience, of all backgrounds actually worked together, came together, for example, for the civil rights movement, for the women's liberation movement, to fight against war, to do the great grape boycott that started in California, and so many other things. The Chinese Exclusion Act was opposed by W.E.B. Du Bois, the most prominent African-American leader and intellectual of the late 1800s and early 1900s. And so there are many points of history that the internment of Japanese Americans, all of these things we can point to also had times where people came together, to stand up for our common humanity, for human dignity of all people. And so, we don't have to go that far back into history. The Vincent Chin case that I was part of, that was in Detroit. We did that with African Americans, Arab Americans, people from all religions and walks of life. The Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith, as well as, LGBT people, women's organizations, labor groups, and the marriage equality movement was a multiracial, multicultural movement. And so we really have to hold up those things and find those stories and find ways to integrate those into our different curricula so that students have another vision in mind, the idea that we can come together as people to do things great and small, and that change, to have examples of change that they can make as young people that become movements, and so those are all things that I think are part of the teaching that come with also the unlearning of how we can only have a world that's fragmented, because that's not true. And there is a better vision that these children can grow up to hold up and be part of.
An excellent suggestion. Stories of fiction, stories, memoirs, nonfiction that we can draw upon. You've given us some of that already, quite a lot in your 3 books for us to draw upon, and there's a lot more out there that humanizes, that we see people fleshed out, that not a single characteristic is what defines them. That sort of thing, that complexity, that nuance. You are all sorts of things. I am all sorts of things.
Right.
And by bringing that to students, we can begin to see this and begin to see the cost of prejudice. And one of the things that I found useful is to emphasize what prejudice costs the larger society, right? And we're talking about that. We talked about that with Francis earlier, about if we exclude those students that you were just mentioning, international students, what are we excluding? A third of the people who teach the subject of artificial intelligence in American universities are from China. They did their undergraduate work in China. So you would be losing all of that talent, just as the Jim Crow laws, the internment of Japanese Americans, all of that denied that talent, that energy, that creativity to the larger society. Prejudice is irrational. There's no question about that. And somehow getting at that. Now we have some questions, Helen, thank you so much for giving us this time. We have some questions here, and I wanted to kind of bring a couple of them together, which is, one of them is, okay, I don't want to be prejudiced. I don't want other people to be prejudiced. Hate speech is wrong, all of that sort of thing. But I also want to talk about negative things that may be happening in China. Can you give our teachers some suggestions about how you talk about these things without saying these are Chinese things, that this is somehow in our DNA, that sort of thing? How do we separate things that we may disagree with in China, that the Chinese government may be engaged in, with people who happen to be Chinese? How do we make that clear?
I think one of the ways is to put what's happening in China or anywhere else in a broader context. Certainly, there are human rights violations taking place in China. We know terrible things have been happening in Tibet with Uyghurs, with labor. We're looking at Hong Kong today, and it would not be a service to anyone to not talk about those things. But I think there is also a larger context about talking about human rights, and putting what's happening in China in a human rights framework. And certainly for children, if we're talking about teaching or talking about things in the USA, we should also look at stormtroopers being sent to Portland and being threatened to come to my city and cities around the country. Is how does that fit into a human rights framework? Possibly squelching the vote, separating children who are asylum seekers and refugees running for their lives, separating them from their parents. And so I think rather than focusing on one country, I would also talk about putting this into a context that students and other people can relate to and see in our own lives, and say, yeah, that's not a good thing that's happening in China. We should talk about that. What can we do about that? And what are things that I see within my world that I can also, I can see and maybe do something about more immediately, but to call out, and as well as, any number of human rights violations we can see around the world. And so I think that's how I talk about these things. I don't try to skirt around them. I have to say, of the 3 books I have out that you so kindly mentioned, Clay, Asian American Dreams, which is about Asian Americans and our experiences in America, My Country Versus Me, which is about the persecution of an ethnic Chinese person, Wen Ho Lee. Those have been read, distributed, even published in China. Last Boat Out of Shanghai is banned in China because it is about people who fled the communist revolution. It's really not anti-communist, but it's about those people. And so I talk about all of them too, to say that, you know, in talking about China, I also want to put that in the context of what Chinese people have experienced, and that's, you know, 100 years of humiliation. And that's one of the, at 100 years of humiliation, being forced to take Western, you know, imperialism in the country, and being forced to have opium there for 100 years. And so that 100 years is one of the things that's driving why China, I think, has a great deal of if you want to, you know, psychoanalyze it, resentment there to the West, has to prove its superiority, is on a trajectory to do that. And so anyway, I think all of these things and what's happening, whether it's in China or the USA or elsewhere in the world, has a broader context. And the more we can understand the larger picture and how we fit into that, I think that's the best way to frame any of these incidents we talk about in China or elsewhere.
I think starting, as you just said, from an idea, a universalist position that humans are entitled just by being alive to certain rights, and should be able to exercise those rights. And starting from there, and using the mirror as well as the binoculars to look at one's own society as well as a distant one. Bill, in the Q&A, he really liked your response, and the key word that he wanted to elevate was listen, not always be concerned with putting your own view, your own interpretation out, but absorbing. And that's what you're saying with regard to using stories and things like that to get other voices, Now, one of the things that people have raised in the Q&A, it's come up in a couple of different ways with regard to the incarceration of Japanese without charge, the extrajudicial incarceration of people, preventive detention during World War II, and these sorts of things. Could you say a little bit about working across Asian ethnic lines? So the whole question about Chinese Americans working with Japanese Americans, working with Cambodians, with others, and again, making common cause.
Sure. You know, we're sitting here in 2020 where there are now more than 20 million Asian Americans in this country. And when I was a kid growing up, and it wasn't that ancient history, but there were, you know, fewer than a million, maybe 800,000 in the census of that time. And most Asian Americans were living in Chinatowns, Japantowns, little Tokyos, Filipino towns, the state of Hawaii. And so in most of America, if you had an Asian face, you were not only seen as an alien foreigner, you were seen as an alien from Mars. And that's the environment I grew up in. So where we are today, you have to think back not that long ago. And it wasn't until 1952 that people of Asian descent could not even become citizens in America. So we couldn't vote, we weren't part of this society, and our numbers are small. So we were in our ethnic ghettos, our ethnic enclaves, and it really has been within contemporary American history that different Asian ethnicities have even come together under this umbrella called Asian America. And, you know, in Asia, nobody says they're Asian. in Asia, people are not only, whether they're their country, they might only identify with their dialect. I'm Cantonese, I'm not Shanghainese, you know. And so this whole idea that people of different Asian backgrounds could come together under and work together and have a common voice and empowerment is actually relatively new. And I have to say the Vincent Chin case was quite the landmark where that began to gel. And why was that? Well, first of all, up until then, the different Asian ethnicities were very small, had enough survival issues on their own to maintain a culture only one generation back or two in most cases. And it wasn't until people said, it sort of doesn't matter whether you're Chinese or Japanese or Filipino or Korean or Vietnamese, you could be attacked and killed, and your killers could go unpunished just because we have a face that looks in common. And so that was the beginning where people said, you know, our numbers are too small to fight for justice and to join in with other groups who wanted to join with us to fight for justice. And so that was the beginning of people coming together. And I have to say, it wasn't always an easy thing to do. When the Vincent Chin case began, it was largely Chinese. Vincent was Chinese American. And we actually had meetings where we would talk about, should we expand this? There's a Japanese American Citizens League in Michigan. Should we invite one of their representatives to be on the board? And we actually had a meeting where we practiced, you know, Chinese have for the most part, single syllable names, you know, like Xia and my last name. And so Minoru Togasaki was coming, and we actually had a practice session to everybody say his name, Minoru Togasaki, so that we wouldn't offend him when he came. And so literally the getting to know you part of beginning to meet with people of other cultures, Asian cultures, was not assumed, and it still isn't. We have different waves of immigration of different ethnicities to America from Asia as well as the rest of the world. And there is, we know, an acculturation process. People may identify first with their sending country before they begin to even feel that they can be accepted as Americans. And that's a different place from 5th, 6th, 7th generation, 10th generation Asian Americans, which there are. And so, so it is a construct, Asian Americans. It's a political, cultural construct here in the United States. And part of the idea is we have things in common, and we are stronger if we are together and can fight for the things that we have in common and raise our voices together, and to get out and vote, and to let people know that Asian Americans have something to say in this country too, and we vote and we can make a difference.
Definitely stronger together. And today, Helen, you've been my teacher. You've been the teacher for our big crowd of attendees. I want to give you the last word here. Tell us about a teacher who touched you. And I know you've had, teachers, throughout your life, and not all of them in the classroom. But is there a teacher who inspired you? And we only have,
I have to say,
30 seconds for this story.
A few seconds. I've had many teachers who inspired me. And the one who, and I've actually stayed in touch with an elementary school teacher and a college teacher. And I have to say, these were teachers who believed in me, who saw times when I was not sure what I was doing, when they were teachers I could turn to just ask them questions, who would challenge me. And so One of them I've written about. Her name is Mrs. George. She's the aunt of Carl Lewis, the long-time medalist in track and field. And she was African-American. She was my teacher throughout my elementary and high school years, off and on in different courses. And she inspired me. She had a sense of humor. The fact that she was Black and a teacher at a time when, you know, in the suburbs of America, there weren't a lot of Black teachers. She was really an inspiration and a role model to me. And so I've written about her. And I just have to say, teachers who believed in me helped me move on and find my way through this American landscape. And I'm just so grateful to all of you for having me here. I also submitted some resources that might be useful in exploring these topics.
Now, that is fantastic. And Helen, those resources are going to be available to all the participants, just as the presentations and that sort of thing. You have definitely carried the torch, and you've passed it to quite a large group today. And so our challenge to all is to act on it, to use some of the ideas that you've shared, some of the experiences that you draw upon with their own students. We are in this together, and by working together, we can accomplish so much. I just want to say thank you to you for giving us all of your writing, your magazine writing, plus these books. These are great resources for people to draw upon. We're going to take a lunch break, and we're back in 45 minutes at 12:45, and we will start promptly. So before we go, though, I'd like to encourage everybody, wherever you are, cheer, because we've just had a wonderful presentation from Helen. Thank you.